So, very warm welcome to you joining us tonight, either live during the Zoom meeting or by watching a recording on the Church in Wales website. Anyway, it's great to have your company. This is the 6th seminar that we've held as the part of the Gofal ein Gwinllan session. This is the end of the second series. We're discussing in various ways how the Church in Wales has contributed to the life of the language and culture of Wales. We've been looking in this series at the 18th century, hearing about very influential people like Ffion and Bridget Devon and Plygain carols and hymnology. So we'll continue tonight with introducing two very effective presenters. Ffion Mair Jones is at in Aberystwyth University near the National Library. So the 18th century has a main area of study, and she's looked at Ieuan, Wales, and the Vines Revolution, and Thomas Pennant's travels to Wales and Scotland and she has particular expertise in correspondence. So tonight she'll be talking to us about slavery and the British Empire in the lives of Goronwy and the Morris brothers of Anglesey. Everybody hear me? Can you? I'll demute myself. My title is not what you've just said. I'm going to talk about the Morris brothers of Anglesey and Goronwy Owen, but I've changed to talk rather about I'll put the screen up, the geographies of Goronwy Owen, so it's changed there. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight, the geographies of Goronwy Owen. And I want to recognise, first of all, the great help I've had by Anne Ryan, a colleague from the Networking Archive project, who has been working with the data I've been using to create charts and maps, which will help this presentation, I hope. So thank you to him for that. Well, Owen has, we have 81 letters by him. There are big gaps there because we really only see one side, the writings of Goronwy Owen himself, but not much of the letters coming back to him. If you look at the chart, there are only 2 letters to Goronwy Owen from Richard Morris, one of the Morris brothers. The correspondence covers from September 1741 until the start of 1773. Goronwy Owen died in 1769, so the last letters come from Richard. If you see the quote there. So quite a sad letter, because Richard Morris had lost all his brothers. All the family had gone apart from his sister, so there was sadness there. So Goronwy Owen getting a letter from him, but he had also died by the time that was written, let alone received in Virginia, the other side of the Atlantic. Well, although I'm not talking specifically about the Morris brothers, they are involved, and they are very strongly the recipients of these letters. 68 letters out of 81, and really that shows who actually kept the letters. So Lewis Morris and Goronwy Owen had an argument, so Lewis got rid of his letters. But Richard was very careful as a naval clerk to note the letters and say when he answered letters, etc. He had a very careful system which reflected his work. So they're the most important correspondence. Then Ieuan Owen was Goronwy's third wife. There's one letter involving her. So here are the Morris family: Lewis, Richard, William, Ellen, the sister who died in 1801 and reached a very good age, and the youngest died very early at sea, and they come from Pentrerian, their home, and that's a place we'll hear more about as we go through these slides tonight. Well, Goronwy Owen is someone who is a legendary man of Anglesey. He wrote very powerful poems about Ynys Môn. So this is Greeting to Anglesey, which is calling Ynys Môn the second Eden and the paradise, and the favourite of God and man, and say a gem in the water there. And that was from his poem in answer to whoever the Barg Goron. We're not seeing any slides, unfortunately. There's some questions in the chat asking if there's a problem with the screen share. Well, maybe I should have a look at that then. Okay, we do share. They're coming now. I go back at one slide to show the pictures of that's the chart showing who he was writing to and who was writing to him. Yeah, and you can see that now. Sorry, thank you for letting me know. So that's a chart I was looking at a couple of minutes ago, and I've gone past that and to talk about the family from Pentrerian, and here is the poem by Goronwy Owen, and now we come to here. So I think we're together now, aren't we? Well, even though Goronwy Owen wrote a lot about Ynys Môn, he didn't live there most of his life. That's why he had a lot of hiraeth for it. That he lived in several other places, and I divide them into different periods here. First in Donington in Shropshire for a year and 5 months. That's a picture of Donington Church, and he was actually a curate in Eppington, a couple of miles up the road, but he lived in Donington, and then Walton near Liverpool in the north then, and he was curate there for 2 years, and then he had a short period in London where he worked with the Cymrodorion Society for 3 months only, and then he became a curate of Northolt in Middlesex. You can see all the locations on the map there with the numbers of letters that he wrote from there. And then, as I've said before, he emigrated to Virginia, And I've noted that as a period when he leaves the south of England to go and live in Virginia, and that continues from 1757 until 1773. And as we said, even though he died before then, the letters were still being written. Well, where were the places that he talks about when he writes? Well, at the top we have two places, London and Ynys Môn. That's very important to him. He talks about Ynys Môn a lot. And so at the top of the chart, you have the places which are connected to the Morris family. London, two of them had lived there, and this one, William Morris, lived there. Gall Madog, Lewis Morris, when he wasn't in London, was in Cerrig-Digdon, and the workplace of Richard Morris was in the Navy Office in Tower Hill. So those are the places which are mentioned most often. Then I'm going to look now at the way Ynys Môn comes into the picture, as well as the poetry. How else does he talk about Ynys Môn, which is key to his life, and in the interpretations of his life later? Well, there's a quote here which is full of nostalgia about his childhood in Ynys Môn, and they mentioned Pentir Ranell, the Morris's home. Richard Morris and Owen started in 30th of May 1752. Say, tell your mum how I remember the honey sandwich I had from her. And she said to me, if you had a tail, he said, if I had a tail, I would wag it. He was so happy. So Goronwy Owen also suggests that he didn't spend so much time in Ynys Môn, apart from some people he knew, like somebody from Penhesgyn. He didn't know many people in Llanelian, just a few people around where I lived, where my mother's family lived. When he went to school for the first time, he wasn't at home very often. She didn't know very many people there. But then he says, only a couple of people remember me, even though hundreds knew me before. That's what he says in his poetry of longing about Ynys Môn. So he contradicts himself, really. So, but it's no doubt that he was an Ynys Môn person, and he used a saying. Yeah, he's using an idiom there that the tide won't wait for anybody in Malldraeth, in the same way. The correspondence must reach Goronwy Owen. So he really loved his native island and his people. So when he moved to Malton, he was talking about Ynys Môn, and this is a quote here from a letter to William Morris, talking about Ynys Welsh in Holyhead, and you can see it there. Just north of Caergybi, Holyhead there, and Morris's home. And he's making a linguistic point here, trying to suggest that there was always a feminine form or every adjective. And one of his examples was gwyllt, which means wild, and saying that Ynys Welsh meant a wild island.
What? Because it was a straw island? Or abounding in straw? Nothing more unlikely. Was it not rather because it was a barren and wild island?
So it wasn't Ynys Welsh, a hay island, straw island, but Welsh being the feminine of wild, as he suggests. And then he talks about his childhood, and Margaret Morris, the mother of Morris brothers, and talks about eating treacle, honey, and butter sandwiches as a child. And Margaret Morris has died by now, and he's expressing his memories of her. And he also wrote a poem connecting Margaret Morris with Pentre Rangell, that nowhere was better than Pentre Rangell, and now it's the saddest place because Margaret has died. So a place which changes with the passage of time. Well, after a short time in London, he ended up in Northolt in Middlesex, and here are words about Pentre Rangell, which shows how important it was. But he talks about it in a different way again. Here he talks about a Goronwy son sent to Wales to learn Welsh, because he didn't know Welsh living in England, but his father wanted him to learn it. And Richard did the same thing. He sent his daughter back to Ynys Môn, but Robin, the son, came into contact with the culture of the area and the people, and the harp they had in Pentre Rangell. And he talked about the telling like that he saw in Wales. The son, even though he'd been at Ynys Môn, he still spoke English, but he wanted a harp like that. And he wants him to learn the harp as well. And then he produces a short poem that everyone should have a harp, and that the harp would shock the devil out of our lives. So that's the culture becoming very important to him there. And then he talks about here a person who lived in Ynys Môn. We thought he didn't know many people in Ynys Môn, but he knew about some kind of hermit in Redforth Bay, and he learned his name was Mr. James. So this hermit actually lives now in London, but he owns a property in Redforth Bay, so he feels some kind of he identifies with him as an exile in London. Well, to emphasize the point, there's another chart how important Ynys Môn is. When he was in Donington, he spoke at the top 9 places, in Walton 15, but in the middle of London, every place scores only 1. And it comes at the end because it's in alphabetical order. But there's a mention of Redforth Bay and Benllech. But when he comes to Northolt, immediately Ynys Môn isn't mentioned hardly. There's a mention of Holyhead, but the place names become English and London places. The Tower of London, for example, and the Navy office at the top there. So there's some kind of change happens there. It's a kind of a distancing from Ynys Môn. Is he losing the strength of his contact with Ynys Môn? And then when he's gone to Virginia, again, Ynys Môn doesn't appear there. There's a change in the way he refers to geographical places. He talks about Great Britain, which hasn't been there before, England, the way he looks at Britain after moving to Virginia. So there are changes over time which are quite interesting, which show us how the geographical situation of Goronwy Owen affects the way he looks and thinks about the way the place he had lived in and where he lives now. Now I'm going to move back to Donington and look at what he says, not about Ynys Môn, but about Shropshire itself. What does he say about this particular place? Well, he talks about the way he gets his post with by the mail coach, etc. But one place is interesting, which is Roxeter, and he's taken an interest in this place because Roman remains had been found at the time. Looking at I can't see those Welsh names in the University of Wales dictionary. It might be something to do with the word for generous. Was it a generous place? But he's a connection between the Romans and the Britons here. But on the other hand, there is an enemy who are the Saxons. So Erigonium were probably destroyed by the Saxons. Well, that's a strange tradition, isn't it? But Goronwy Owen has been living in Donington. He knows this tradition. So he has become part of where he was living. He is looking and listening at what is being said about the local area. So he has truly been become a native of that place. And then, after leaving Donington, he again shows the importance of Donington for him. He's got a copy by Gofal ein Gwinllan, one of the early poets from the 12th century. And this was called the boast or the rejoicing of Gofal. Gofal was fighting for his lord. It's Owen ein Gwinllan, I think. I'm not sure of that, but that's what I think. But he was fighting on the border, and Goronwy Owen interprets this poem.
The latter, which was for many centuries the seat of war, the Ffion barrier frontier of the Cambrian dominions. What leads me to this opinion, therefore, is that I find mention made of the Goronwy. This river is to this day called by the Welsh Goronwy and by the English Vernoise.
So he's seen this word in the poem, which is a very difficult poem to interpret. especially, of course, Goronwy wouldn't have a grammar book. He often complains that he didn't have help with the grammar for early poetry. So he didn't have many resources to help him. He'd just used his own natural knowledge of the Welsh language to interpret this rather difficult text, and had noticed, as J. Lloyd Jones had said, that this poem was written when Gwelchmai was the court poet of Madog and Meredydd in poets, although we know now that probably wasn't the case. And then we can see the way that Owen interpret this poem, and the later interpretation by J.K. Gwynllan's Peredur Lynch, they're very similar. And the only problem appears at the end. So Goronwy just fails at the end, where he misinterprets. It's too complex to explain what this is about, but he does go astray there in that interpretation at the end. Well, he wasn't correct, but even though he recognizes Fernwy, he doesn't see the place Dygenfreiddin here, which is one of the old names for the Bryden Hills. Right? So that's another hidden place name that Goronwy didn't recognise. But, he did very well with the rest. Well, we'll go on to his time at Walton. And Walton at the time was very handy for connecting with Ynys Môn. So most of the letters with William Morris came from this period. So letters could arrive directly by sea between Ynys Môn and Liverpool, and he had visitors from Mr. Vaughan of Gosogedol to Walton in 1753. Ready to do everything that Goronwy wanted as help to him, and he was president of the Cymrodorion in London at the time. And then Mr. Mawson was one of the excise officers in Beaumaris, came with a letter from William Morris directly to Goronwy, and then when Goronwy was thinking of going to London, he asked William Morris if he could come and see him, and to persuade him, he talks about Captain Seckerverl, and started from Beaumaris at 7 in the morning, and he arrived in Lerpwl, an old form of Lerpwl, at 5 in the afternoon on the and he's crossed by sea and then travelled by horse to see Goronwy. So he wouldn't have come over the Menai Bridge, would he? But he would have crossed to the mainland and then by horse to Liverpool from wherever he landed. Well, that's how easy it was to come from Ynys Môn to Walton, according to Goronwy Owen. So we've looked at two important places where Ynys Môn is still on his agenda, but where they're supposed to other areas as well. And he was quite strongly attracted to Shrewsbury, or to Shropshire. His brother lives there in Oswestry, for one thing, and he talks about the Welsh connections of Shropshire, and the bookshop selling Welsh-language books, which the natives didn't understand. And in comparing Lancashire and Shropshire, he tells that Lancashire, the people are better than Hottentots. That's a racist comment, but it was used very often in the 18th century. Lancashire was cold and expensive, but Shropshire was much warmer, and he would much rather be in Shropshire. So there's a hiraeth there, not just for Ynys Môn, but for Shropshire. Well, moving across the border, Goronwy Owen became one of the Welsh people living outside Wales in England. And Simon Brooks has mentioned these people in his book Hanes Cymru, talking about these as invisible people. So there wasn't a category where we included these people. So, no census notes them, and they still can't, I don't think, note that they are Welsh people. Well, Simon Brooks says even they had minority in ethnic attributes. They had a diaspora character. So this was epistemological injustice in that we can't recognise this category. So that these Welsh people are not present in multicultural categories in England. So they don't exist in the eyes of England. So it's a very difficult situation to be in, I would imagine. So there's good evidence in Goronwy's letters about how difficult this was. So he comes across lots of Welsh people who try to deny their Welsh. People who don't want to recognise that they were Welsh. He talks about Mr. Owen in Walton. He got such impression on Welsh people time and again in England, which is very depressing really for him. Well, to end, I'm going to show a slide of London, one of the locations which is important to him. Not that he wanted to be an Englishman, like many Welsh in England, in terms of his situation of geography. He felt far away from Wales, but he lived in Norfolk for 2 years, very close to London. But during that time, we get the feeling of what the Welsh geography of London was. And some of these places noted show where the places which were important for the Welsh people in the capital city of Britain in the middle of the 18th century, including places Duke Street. Owen Mair was a patron of Lewis Morris at the time, and who Goronwy asked for sponsorship from. So Dover Street, the house of William Vaughan Costegedol in London, one of the gentry again. We're not sure where the other powers lived. Was it Berkeley Square or Mayfair? Or it could have been in Westminster Street. There's uncertainty about where he lived. So he showed how Goronwy didn't know exactly where especially the gentry, the richest people lived. A temple is mentioned as well, right in the centre there. That's where Dr. Samuel Nichols lived. He was the vicar of Northolt, where Goronwy was curate. He was master of a temple there, that's mentioned, and the locations of the Cymrodorion filled by Lewis and Richard Morris in 1751 in London, which were they frequented the Navy Office, Richard Morris's workplace, so from 1748 when he was appointed clerk there, and also in the same area was the Royal Mint, and William Parry, the secretary, first secretary of the Cymrodorion, lived there. And then the Half Moon in Cheapside, where the Cymrodorion meet. You can't see the label Half Moon, it's hidden there, but it was Cheapside there, and they met there the first Wednesday of every month. And there are pictures, at least one picture of the meetings of these people who included Goronwy, and then Love Lane, somebody, John Davis from Carmarthenshire lived there, and John Thomas, and then it lived in Howie Court, the Strand. He was one of the Cymrodorion by the 60s, maybe after Goronwy time there. But one other person I talk about is the printer William Owen, who lived in Temple Bar, near the centre there. And Goronwy went towards his last days in London before he left for America. He was wanting his poetry printed. There'd been a bit of difficulties with the Morris brothers by then, especially with Lewis Morris. So Goronwy were trying to find some way of self-publishing his at that time. But with the help of Richard Morris, who was very experienced in publishing. So these weren't just patrons, were people who could publish his work and help him to make money out of his poetry that he hadn't been able to do during his life until then. I think there was another quote to come here at the top here. And when he first arrived in London, he went to live with Andrew Jones in Cheapside. That's where he lived. That's hidden under the label there. Andrew Jones, a member of the Cymrodorion, Goronwy went to live with him when he first arrived. And he says the Fardd is in town again, and expecting the Muse to appear in the next coach from Liverpool after him. So, to end, a slide showing all the places he referred to, many of them in England and Wales, but one of the acquaintances of Goronwy was Captain Thomas Fawkes, and he talks about Thomas Fawkes going to Guinea, and the way why he went there was to fetch slaves and take them to America. And then when Goronwy emigrated to Virginia, he had a plantation and slaves as well. So it's rather a dark end to the story to end. So we've seen a map of the world and see how the geographies are so varied in a more localized area and across the world. So I hope you've enjoyed that talk and thank you for listening. Well, thank you very much, Ffion. That was very interesting. And you've mentioned the dark side. Maybe we can talk more about it after 8:30 and go after that. That is a very relevant matter to our age, especially in the last year. The question from Manon Cridwen James is asking, was the faith and priesthood of Goronwy Owen, was it important to him? Was it obvious in his work? Or was it a way to get a salary? Well, good question. I would think that he had the necessary faith. There are many references to the clerics and their lives, who he got on with and who he didn't, and many references to the work he had to do as a curate, which is very interesting. Obviously, he had to write sermons, but he wrote many when he was in Donington, but when he went to Walton, he used them again. There's an interesting comment when he says, my Donington sermons are almost finished now, so I'll write some more. So that was reality of life for him. It was quite a difficult time. He had to go and visit sick people, and because it was an area where Catholicism were very strong, he found that there were many deaths there, and he had to make a special effort to beat the Catholics to the sick people before they died, or the Catholics who could have last rites, and he wanted to stop that happening as a Protestant. So he was standing for Protestantism against Catholicism there, so I would take it that he believed in what he was doing. Yeah, and of course he complained he wasn't paid enough, and he kept looking for better pay, but that's fair enough, isn't it? Man shall not live by bread alone, but he did have to ensure the material side of life was good, especially after getting married and having children. And Dr. Gofal Lake says about the lack of references to Ynys by the Northolt period. But what about the evidence of the poetry? A good question, Gofal. I have not looked at the poetry in any chronological order, but there are famous poets by the Hiraeth am Bôn, the longing for Ynys Môn. I would think I would love cut that again. That's a very good point. The question is he writing the poems because he's trying to write about what the Morris brothers have heard? Because the Morris brothers would want to hear poems like that. What influence did they have? That poem responding to Barl Coch Mon, he wanted to divide that poem, to get away from the response to the Barl Coch there. That was possible. Then there are poems where he thinks of himself up in the garrets in the city. So I was thinking about the longing for this one. I've got part of the text here, and he refers to theological and scriptural comments, the second Eden, etc. It's interesting to hear that second Eden, the old paradise. There are lots of scriptural comments there. Is there evidence in the letters of the connection between spiritual faith and is the faith of the church? Especially thinking about slavery now. There's talk in Exodus about slavery, about exile, about freedom as well. So he'd left, and this one as a young man and never gone back. There's distance there, there's longing. I'm trying to think. There is a reference to being enslaved. He talks about the Kangana alliteration being an enslaving thing, but I don't know how much further he took that. Well, there might be an opportunity after apostate to have a wider discussion and see whether the audience has something to contribute there. So there'll be a formal thanks at the end. But following the very interesting presentation by Ffion, now it's a great pleasure to introduce Gerald to you. Having studied English in Cambridge Universities and Celtic Studies in Oxford, Gerald has served Wales all his life as a teacher, a head teacher, and an university lecturer. I looked at the Welsh Books Council website at so many volumes that he's written about the history of Ceredigion, the background of Dewi Sant, the history of Wales, Ceredigion, a wealth of history, Dinefwr, a phoenix in Wales, and the last word, a last chapter in the history of the Welsh language. But you don't have to wait for that to be published, but now he's going to talk to us about Edward Richard and Ieuan Fardd. So we're looking forward very much to what you have to share with us. Thank you for the invitation and for Ancarad's patience in making the arrangements. Edward Richard and Ieuan Fardd, two poets, two Welshmen from Ceredigion. They were learned in Greek and Latin. Edward Richard could call Ieuan my dear firstborn, the beginning of my strength. Well, shouldn't there be something, a lot in common between them? But no, they were very different. The most obvious of that was one was an alcoholic and the other wasn't. The most important difference was in terms of their ambition. Edward Richard wanted to be a successful teacher in a successful school. He did do some poetry, but that was a sideline for him. He corresponded to Lewis Morris and others in English and belittled his ability in Welsh. And despite Osborne Thomas's view, it's difficult for me to think that he taught in Welsh in his school. His main aim was to create a grammar school, a grammar school of the classics. He emphasised that, and he succeeded. He played a small but important part in the development of the Welsh Church, because many of the students of Ystrad Meirig came to be priests in the Anglican Church in Wales. Ystrad Meirig wasn't the only school in Wales. There had been grammar schools continuing since Henry VIII's time. They were very small ones and for boys only, like Ystrad Meirig. Another way to gain education was through the nonconformist academies. The main problem of those, that they tended to be one-man bands, moving from place to place and ending with the death of the teacher. Carmarthen was an exception. Ystrad Meirig could have gone that way at the beginning, but luckily Thomas Oliver, a Welsh priest who is not noted in the Welsh biography, had given land for establishing a school in Lledrod, near Ystrad Meirig. So a trust was established, and Edward Richard, who had already started in Ystrad Meirig, as head of Lledrod as well. But quite soon the two schools became one, and we don't hear any more about Lledrod. The result of it all, that there was a regular salary for the teacher, and Edward Richard himself gave more land to the trust. Among the trustees of Ystrad Meirig were members of the main families of North Ceredigion, the Powells and Nanteas, the Lloyds of Osableiddiaid, the Vaughans of Trawsgwaed. Edward Richard enjoyed their company, and the school profited from that. The trustees were responsible for the income and the appointments of the schools. So Edward Richard School was on a firm foundation to continue after he died. Well, when he did die, a new head teacher could be appointed, a former pupil, John Williams, the son of the smith of Swyddfynon, who became known as the Hen Surrey, Old Sir. He was head teacher of Ystrad Meirig for 41 years. And that's maybe the golden age of the school. More space had been provided, and even though the St David's College in Lampeter took over much of the preparation for the church after 1827, Ystrad Meirig continued up to the middle of the 20th century, where many priests coming there after the Second World War, and the end only came in 1974. We shouldn't forget something else that ensured the success of Ystrad Meirig. Edward Richard had created a wonderful library for the school, which William Howells has written about. We don't know exactly what the contents of the library was. It was a substantial one, everything in its own building. What I could do with that in the schools I was at? Well, the result was to ensure that there was a supply of Welsh-speaking Welsh people who could become priests in the church in Wales and beyond. We don't know what kind of teacher he was, but we know from his letters, his poems, and the varied content of his library that he was a man of wide interests, and some people thought he was a Unitarian. The only tribute to him is by his former pupil Dafydd Ionawr. Dafydd Ionawr wasn't a genius of the poet, but he says about his former teacher that he knew what education was and the depths of learning. And now that Wales is now farewelling this special teacher. Edward Richard at Convers Lewis Morris, so that he didn't know the names of his pupils, which would be considered a weakness in a teacher. But his success over all those years does show how effective it was. Well, in those days, of course, preparing for the priesthood was very different from what it is now. And to remember how bad things were in contemporary England, because the Oxford and Cambridge preparation was very lacking in many ways. And it took a long time for the Anglicans to understand the success of nonconformism showed they had to improve. So within the limitations of the time, the work of Edward Teacher was a great contribution to the life of the Welsh Church in the second half of the 18th century. Well, compared to Edward Richard, Ieuan Fardd was a Welshman who wasn't on a straight path. He was ambitious as a poet and a scholar. And he did produce some specimens of the poetry of the ancient Welsh bard, and also contributed to Rhys Jones's volume, Gorchestion Mair Cymru. He did shine there, but it has to be recognised that Ieuan had the makings of a great scholar. He could work effectively and concentrate on what he wanted to do, and he understood the old manuscripts as well as the great scholars of England. And he knew that every language changed with time, and he could recognise when he couldn't understand the ancient language. He avoided the orthographic problems that came from Edward Llwyd, and even though he was very careful in the way he discussed his Macpherson and his Ossianic texts in English, he was more critical in Welsh. He really wanted to see, it was an obsession to see reforms in the Welsh Church, and he just couldn't understand how he couldn't achieve this. Two factors meant that he wouldn't succeed. The first was his own character as a poor and alcoholic curate. Everybody knew about his weakness. And in a time of crisis, he had to join the army. And another time, he tried to kill himself. The other factor was the Anglican Church in Wales was completely at the whim of the Crown of England. Many things had contributed to that. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, Edward VI and Elizabeth, the foolishness of James II, and the so-called Glorious Revolution that had created a church which was just a faithful servant, which didn't want to change its situation. And even by the time of Margaret Thatcher, the government wanted to keep the church in check. So what hope was there for Ieuan Fardd, the curate of many parishes, to ensure any reform? Obviously, he wanted this so much. He produced the grievances of the Principality of Wales in the Church, considered and laid open in 3 essential articles, which is known more often about the essay on English bishops. And we can notice criticisms like this, that Welsh bishops were Englishmen, and that they'd been appointed for political reasons, and they just wanted to make the most of their jobs, that they wanted to see the end of the Welsh language, and that they made sure that English people were appointed to Welsh parishes, that the Welsh churches were very poor because many taxes went to rich lay people. And St David's had not achieved an archiepiscopal status, despite Gerald Cambrensis' whole work. So if Gerald couldn't succeed, what was a poor curate to do? We had to wait until 1920 before the Welsh Church became independent. Well, it can't be accepted that these bishops became bishops in Wales for personal profit. They were the poorest dioceses in Wales, in England, in the whole country. But it was a step into more lucrative English dioceses, and even to Canterbury itself. So, and the government of the day wanted their loyal people to sit in the House of Lords as bishops. But the parishes were poor because many of them had lost the tithe that was owed to them, because they were owned by lay owners. So some families could actually live very well just on the income from the tithes. Rasmus Saunders had shown the truth of Ieuan's complaints in this place 40 years earlier, with more detailed evidence on Ieuan. Ieuan's language wasn't at all moderate, especially as he wrote the Welsh introduction to his essay. He said that the bishops were intrusive foreigners who wanted to turn us into English people ourselves. We must ask on as Majesty the King and the Parliament to send these oppressors out of our country. Some hopes. But Ieuan they said that we are abused by Welsh people, by these English bishops, and if we don't get rid of them, true religion Wales will disappear. We only have priests who know nothing about the language, when the native Welsh people have to beg on them for crumbs. Our monolingual people aren't helped in any way by these people, but our labourers pay their tithes just as if we had true teachers. Well, Ieuan's English is less extreme than his Welsh, but the accusation was the same, and all in an essay addressed to the Bishop of Canterbury themselves. It's no wonder that Richard Morris and others had told him that he couldn't and shouldn't publish such a thing. I want to suggest that Ieuan's feelings overcame his instincts as a scholar. Some estimates of poetry of the ancient Welsh bards is a very considered work. And he says he wants to address in 3 languages: the Welsh-speaking Welsh, in effective Welsh, the English, in effective English, and an European market who would read Latin. And of course, it wouldn't have been published other than that Daines Barrington, the Englishman, published it. The essay about the English bishops is untidy compared to that true work of scholarships. So the Cymrodorion had taken a case before the Court of Arches to try to unseat Thomas Bowles, a committed Englishman, as rector of Treidraeth Ynys Môn, a monolingual Welsh parish. And that had persuaded Ieuan and his friends not to publish the essay. Well, before the matter came to court, Ieuan produced his long English poem, The Love of Our Country, and he says, "The sheep for want of shepherds go astray, and grievous wolves upon their mountains prey." In the foreword to the poem, he says,
illegal attempts to introduce persons unacquainted with our language into our churches will, I hope, continue till time is no more.
And it was Ieuan himself who actually coined the useful term Anglo-Welsh. In 1773, Ieuan produced his most substantial volume, 2 volumes of Welsh sermons with an English introduction which presents the work to Sir Watkin Williams-Wynne. He attacked his co-priests. It is a pity that they should not do something besides eating and drinking to convince the world that they are ministers of the gospel. And he criticises the bishops and the Welsh clergy for not taking notice of the Welsh language. But he didn't succeed in influencing the church. It was his scholarship that was his main success. Well, his final strike was his poems to St David's, and they were found in verses by Aneurin Lewis. Talking about St David's without its true status, without recognition of the saints, and a load of priests producing their services in English. And the Welsh language is not heard anymore. And the foreign language of the English is there through their useless bishops. His end was a sad one. Without seeing much of his Welsh poetry in print, without seeing any real difference in the state of the church, having giving his collection of manuscripts to Paul Panton to make sure they were kept. His collection of books were in the hands of Edos, the printer who hadn't been paid because probably Ieuan had drunk the subscriptions. He died on the cold floor of Canowdre, and his mother found his dead body hours later. But when I think about Ieuan, I will remember Saunders Lewis's tribute to H.R. Jones, who established Plaid Cymru, and I will adapt it somehow. He was a purist of his generation. His love for Wales and the Welsh language was like a lamp in his breast. Well, thank you very much, Gerald. You've enthused a lot of our listeners tonight. Somebody was saying about the lack of Welsh in a particular place, Plws a Change. So the problems that the church faced, and we as Welsh speakers knew as in the church trying to safeguard and to promote our language, we had the same problems several centuries ago. So I don't know if that should comfort us or not, but that the battle is continuing. So thank you very much for referring to that. So I have a question about the relationship between the Stradmeirig and Lampeter, both having trained priests for the church in Wales. Was there much contact between the two? They went very far from each other geographically. Were they totally independent of each other? I think somebody else will answer those questions, Ainsley. I'm very unsure to go into the 19th century on that. So maybe in the later discussion somebody can answer that. So I just went thinking, did Stradmeirig have more of an influence on the Welsh speakers, and Lampeter was more English? So a question from Tim: what's the attitude? What's the attitude to the Methodists? Total hatred, I would say. The odd thing is that he didn't see the point I was trying to make, that the success of the nonconformists, the Methodists, and the other sects proved the weakness of the church. The weaknesses of the church, I would say. But the problem was there was no way of dealing with these things until you had more enlightened bishops. You didn't have to wait for bishops to be Welsh speakers. We had to wait till 1875 for that. But people like Burgess was a great bishop, and he did very much to do what was possible within his power to make things better in St David's. But in Ieuan's period, things were very servile, really. Thank you very much. It's really interesting, and these people weren't very familiar to me, but they faced challenges similar to the church today. So thank you for opening our eyes to these things. Is there another question in the chat, maybe? No, I don't see one, but maybe people will want to ask a question face to face after apostate, and maybe they'll have thought of further questions by then. So thank you so much, Gerald, for that excellent contribution. Very, very interesting. And I hope we'll go after those two people and see how we might see how some of the questions and challenges are relevant today. So thank you very much for that. Well, we've had a great time here again tonight. I'm very grateful to you, to Gerald and Ffion, for addressing us tonight. So I'm going to ask Reverend Lynn Davies to say a word of thanks on our behalf to both. I hope Lynn is here. Yes, here he is. So welcome, Lynn. Thank you, Ainsley. And great to have the opportunity to do this. So thank you for excellent presentations. And they've taken me along Lost Language lines to my teen age years. And the A-level course, I was studying in Britain here, Goronwy, Owen, in those days, and that's the first time I got to know them and the Morris family. And it's interesting, I didn't know anything about them since then, because I've followed them around then. And I've been to look for Donington and Roxeter, Llanymel, Tre'r Ystad, Meirig, fi'n Cynaundre, and to Ifor Hael's courts, following those authors and priests. That's my personal way of saying how I enjoyed so much your presentation. But if I had come without any enthusiasm, without knowing anything about these people, both of you would have really converted me. Thank you very much, and Ffion, and for to talk about Ieuan Fardd's comment on the Welsh language. It was very grave to say that. Well, I think you're the best congregation with me saying that. I laughed so much reading the Morris's letters. That's the only time I was asked to leave a library for disturbing other readers when I was reading their letters. That's been on my conscience for many years. But thank you very much to all of you who contribute to this tonight and this series. Thank you very much.